Right. Trump, the latest one, Trump said he's willing to end the war without the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. When I first saw it, I don't really believe him. I think he's just another whatever, you know. But according to White House spokesperson Caroline Levitt, she said that he's going to make an announcement or something tonight. So sounds it's like a pretty formal thing. What's your take on that?
Well, firstly, I don't believe him either. I don't believe there's any truth to these things that Donald Trump says about, walking away from the war with Iran still in control of the Strait of Hormuz, operating its toll booth, as more and more people are calling it. I don't believe a word of what he says anymore. That's the first thing to say.
Mhm.
Secondly, about these statements. Well, again, I'm fairly used to this from the Ukraine war because we get, uh, we get advance notification that Trump is going to make some big statement. And once upon a time, what that meant to me was that the president of the United States was going to go to the Oval Office.
Mhm.
He was going to talk to the American people, the Resolute desk there, and looking into the camera, and he'd make a direct address to the American people. And with Trump, it's never like that. What happens is he has a kind of meeting, he calls in the media, there's the usual chaotic toing and froing. He says all sorts of things, some of them utterly insulting, some of them crazy, some of them completely beside the point. And we don't get any sort of coherent statement from him at all. So I'm not particularly
Mhm.
um, frankly
Mhm.
impressed about or anticipating any major statement from him. But what is ominous is that we still continue to see a military build-up in the Persian Gulf. So he still is sending more aircraft there. He's still sending more troops there. He's still engaging in further military deployments there. Everything to my mind clearly points to some escalation of the war within the next few weeks.
I think he kept on saying these kind of things because at the same time he is also a person who care very much about the stock market and the oil price.
Yes.
So he still want to somewhat control that front. So with those statements, I guess that's what he's trying to do, right?
Well, I think it's exactly what he's trying to do, and I think it's completely unethical. I mean, he's lying to keep the stock market and the oil prices happy. I mean, it's absolutely brazen. The thing that amazes me about it is that the people, who you'd expect are rather hard, tough-minded,
Mhm.
ruthless, cynical traders on these markets, they want to believe him. So, he says he comes up with these um, obviously untrue statements like, I am negotiating with the Iranians, or there is a new reasonable government in Iran that I'm dealing with. And what immediately happens is, stock market rises, oil price falls. That they let themselves be tricked like this time and again, I find quite extraordinary. And I mean, it does tell you an awful lot about the kind of people who are really running things in the markets now.
Okay, so let's look at the China and Pakistan, right? The
Mm.
Pakistani foreign minister is now visiting China, so they put out a 5 points proposal. Immediate cessation of hostilities, start peace talks as soon as possible, security of the non-military targets, security of shipping lanes, primacy of the UN Charter. So this is not like their proposal for a peace plan. This is basically jointly saying, you guys, can you stop and start talking? Is that
Yeah,
what they're
absolutely.
trying
That's exactly
to do, right?
that is exactly correct. I mean, what they want is an arrangement where there is complete end to the conflict and negotiations begin. And notice, and this is very important, there is no set of demands there
Mhm.
as to what the parties should agree in the negotiations. This has been a disaster. I mean, we have lists of demands in the United States. Iran must give up nuclear enrichment. Iran must give up ballistic missiles. Iran must do this. Iran must do that. There's nothing like that from the Chinese and the Pakistanis. And the Iranians now, of course, because they've been given lists of demands, and the Americans have taken to doing the same. All American bases must be removed from the Middle East, all of that.
Mhm.
what the Chinese are saying, by the way, what the Pakistanis are saying, what the Russians are saying, what, and I said this myself on my programs, what you need to do is you need to take off the whole idea of military action off the table. That is completely the wrong approach. Um, it's been an absolute disaster for all the countries involved and for the global economy. You need to stick to first principles and you need to have proper negotiations in good faith, building on the common interests of the parties and working towards a solution. That is what a mediator, a real, genuine mediator, is supposed to do. And some and well, I think there is enough commonality of interest here on both sides to find a solution in that way. After all, Iran says it doesn't want nuclear weapons. The United States says it doesn't want Iran to have nuclear weapons. So why are they at war?
Yeah.
I mean, it
Yeah.
makes absolutely no sense. So this is logic. It makes complete sense. The problem is the sides are not going to stop. And the reason they're not going to stop is this, because for Trump to stop and leave the Iranians in control of the Strait of Hormuz is inconceivable. It is impossible. Already, any end to the conflict, which leaves the present government of Iran in place, is going to be seen across the world as a defeat for Trump and for the United States. That's one. And on the Iranian side, and here I think they have much better course, they don't trust the United States anymore. They don't trust Donald Trump. They say, look, if we do all of these things, if there's a ceasefire, the American ceasefire, we ceasefire, and we reopen the Strait of Hormuz, how do we know that in a month's time, when the oil prices have stabilized, this won't start all over again? So the Chinese Pakistani proposal makes absolute sense. There's an enormous amount of work to be done. The Chinese and the Pakistanis need to start speaking to both sides. A framework can be constructed on the basis of this proposal. There need to be guarantees provided to Iran that this won't resume. And the United States, for its part, needs to commit itself to stopping the bombing. There was a brilliant statement, brilliant editorial, laying it all out, by the way, in Global Times just the other day, setting this all out and saying, what is this G7 statement that they published, which is absolutely empty? Why don't they just say simply stop bombing? Why don't they say something as simple as that? Isn't that what needs to happen first? And then we can move on. So you could see which the direction that China is taking.
I find it's interesting that they are trying to be as practical as possible because one thing it says security of non-military targets. So they didn't even say security of everybody, everything. They put in non-military targets, meaning Iran right now, I think they are targeting military targets, although I think they are also saying they are going to start looking into like a contractors, like a companies who are helping the US military, like high-tech companies. Okay. But nonetheless, so far, it seemed to me like Iran has been focusing on military bases. Okay.
Yeah.
So this proposal saying security of non-military targets, they are even saying, okay, what Iran basically is doing is okay. The US should stop bombing like Iranian hospitals and schools. They should stop doing that. I think they're trying very hard to make it as acceptable as possible for both sides, right?
Well, absolutely. But here again, we have a major problem. One can imagine a scenario
Hmm.
in which the Americans might even agree to something like that. But the other party to this war, Israel, never will. And that is a fundamental problem. So Israel attacked the South Pars gas field about a week ago.
Hmm.
Israel has attacked Iran's steel mills. Israel has attacked all sorts of other locations across Iran. They made it absolutely clear that they're going to continue conducting attacks of this kind. And one gets the sense that the Israeli policy is basically a scorched earth policy. And they seem to be very successful in pulling the Americans along with them.
Mm-hmm.
So uh, the day before yesterday, we had this unbelievable, terrible Truth Social post from Donald Trump, in which he said that unless Iran opens, capitulates, or he opens, starts negotiations, serious negotiations, he's going to destroy the entire energy system of Iran. He's going to attack the gas fields. He's going to attack the desalination plants, do all of those things. Now, what the Iranians have shown is that if they are faced with this kind of offensive against their infrastructure and their economy, they will respond. So after the Israeli attack on the South Pars gas field, they attacked the LNG facilities in Qatar. And unless the US both decides that it's going to stop doing this
Mm-hmm.
and gets its Israeli ally to stop doing this, it's impossible to see how this will happen.
The guarantor, I think, really is a big issue. I mean, who can guarantee that the US and Israel will not violating whatever the peace deal they can come up with, or assuming they can. I mean, it's very questionable whether they can come up with something. But who can guarantee that once the peace deal is signed, the very next day Israel assassinating another Iranian leader? Who can
Yeah.
guarantee that?
Well, nobody can. I mean, this is the problem, and this is why this war is going to be so difficult to solve. The issues between the parties can be bridged. I mean, I said already,
Mhm.
Iran says it doesn't want nuclear weapons.
Mhm.
The US says it doesn't want
Yeah.
Iran to have nuclear weapons. So why is there even this war at all?
Yeah.
What has been destroyed is trust.
Yeah.
There is no trust
Mhm.
because the Iranians believe that the United States, but especially Israel, wants to destroy them,
Mhm.
and that every negotiation that is conducted with the Americans, with the Israelis in the background, is therefore a negotiation conducted in bad faith. And how do you bridge that? Well, there are all sorts of things that can, in theory, be done. Iran is a member of BRICS. There
Mhm.
might be some kind of security guarantees provided by China and Russia.
Mhm.
I know that's been floated. Those would be very difficult to negotiate. The Iranians themselves have, until very recently, shown unwillingness to accept those kind of guarantees. They were never offered by China, but I happen to know they were offered by Russia.
Mhm.
But Iran said no
Mhm.
because it values its independence.
Mhm.
So solving this one is going to be very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, China has not said anything. I think part of it, I think China is unwilling to be the guarantor because China knows you
Yeah.
can't guarantee. I mean, these kind of
Well,
things.
I
How
think.
do you stop
Well, that's right. Well, that's right.
assassination from,
Yeah.
Israel to assassinate more Iranian leaders and terrorist attacks here and there? I mean, nobody can.
Yes.
No,
No.
it's almost impossible to.
It is
Um,
almost impossible, but nonetheless, it's useful that China says these things.
mhm, mhm,
This statement does show us the pathway towards sanity.
mhm, mhm.
Before we have peace,
Yeah,
we have to achieve sanity.
yeah.
At the moment, we don't have sanity, and
Mhm.
that's the problem.
Another thing that I don't see much reports in the West media, but China did report that Iranian they are floating, I mean, they are discussing a law to make the charging, the toll booth or the charging of the vessels passing the Strait of Hormuz, make it like a law. And it's
Yeah.
interesting in this framework. Now, it's not law yet, but this is the framework that vessels from United States, Israel, and nations participating in the sanctions against Iran, they will be prohibited from passage. NATO members and US allies, like Japan and South Korea, their fee will be $1.5 to $2 million. And then other ordinary, they call them neutral nations, will be charged between 150,000 to 200,000 US dollars. friendly nations, including China, Russia, India, and Pakistan, will be granted a free passage. And the system will be accepting Chinese yuan, and they will working with Oman to set up the system. So this is the framework that I don't see much reporting about in the West. I assume the United States will never accept that. Is that right?
Well, of course it won't. I mean, they will vehemently oppose it,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm going to say what I personally think. I think that this idea is probably more the Iranians giving themselves a card when negotiations do eventually start, which they will. I mean, there will be negotiations at some point. I'm not sure whether this is legal, by the way. I mean, in
Uh-huh.
terms of international maritime law, because the Strait of Hormuz is a naval a sea route, and I think that they're governed by international maritime law, which does not allow countries to set up these kind of restrictions on passage through them.
Yeah, because this will be very significant if it's really become a normalized thing, right? Then,
Well, it will transform the whole world. I mean, one country which will be very unhappy, I'll tell you this, is Russia. Because if
okay.
the Iranians are able to do this to the Straits of Hormuz, the Turks will do it with the Dardanelles,
Hmm.
the Danes will
Hmm.
do it with the Skagerrak. Much of Russia's overseas trade
Hmm.
passes through the Black and Baltic Seas.
Hmm.
Of course, they're now developing the Northern Sea route through the Arctic, but still,
Hmm. Yeah. I think if this really become like a normalized thing, everybody accept that. Not only there will be more people, countries will be thinking, well, why
yes,
don't we do the same thing?
yes,
But
yes.
also this whole idea of freedom of navigation, it will collapse, isn't it? That
Well,
the,
absolutely, but the Iranians here, who are far from stupid, by the way, are
mm,
making a very, very simple point. They say, how can you have freedom of navigation
mm,
when there is no freedom of trade?
yeah.
If the US is putting restrictions on trade on everybody by imposing sanctions all the time and tariffs everywhere, then freedom of navigation at that point already starts to make no sense.
Hmm.
So it's, an intellectually compelling point. To be honest, I don't think China would be happy with this
Yeah.
proposal, this Iranian proposal
Mhm.
to control access through the Strait of Hormuz either, even if China is exempt. I mean, what would happen, say, if the Malacca Strait was
Mhm.
controlled in the
Mhm.
same kind of way? I mean, this is dangerous implications from every conceivable point of view.
It's interesting you're talking about that. That's one concern that China constantly have, which is the
Yeah,
Strait of Malacca,
yeah,
right? So
yes, yes,
not only they can charge, I mean, if they start charging fees, but
yeah,
also they could
yeah.
block it. Okay, I mean,
Absolutely.
so
Mm.
China has been developing alternative routes, so
Of
and
course
they
it
have
has.
been pretty successful. I think they have some alternative routes.
Of
But
course they
not,
do. Yeah.
yeah, but nonetheless, this is not something that China want to see happening. Okay, that.
No, no. I mean, it is the world's greatest trading
Yeah.
country now. It's far overtaken the United States. It has the
Yeah.
world's biggest merchant marine. It exports its goods all over the world. I mean, it has an interest both in freedom of trade and in freedom of navigation,
Mhm.
far more so than the United States does, which pretends that it protects freedom of navigation, but in fact never does.
In that sense, I actually think from China's perspective that the freedom of navigation that U.S. championing for is by itself not a bad thing, right? We should have freedom of navigation. It's just the U.S. saying that it's keeping
Yeah.
those all the sea lanes safe, but in reality, it's very assertive and also sometimes coercive with the other
It's,
things, right?
it's completely dishonest. The Americans say that they support freedom of navigation, but it's not been said in good faith. Never
Mhm.
has been. What
Mhm.
the United States is really up to is asserting its control of
Mhm.
global sea lanes, which
Mhm.
is a completely different thing. Of course, they don't talk about it in that way. They say, oh
Mhm.
no, it's all freedom of navigation. We're
Mhm.
all here to ensure that navigation is free. But as the Iranians correctly say, if you're imposing sanctions on everybody and you're seizing ships and you're doing all the kind of things that the US does regularly, then
Yeah.
you cannot come forward in all honesty and tell everybody that you're in favor of free navigation. You obviously are not.
Trump also posted this on his Truth Social, which is got lots of attention in China as well. He says all those countries that can't get their jet fuels now that's a big problem, jet fuels now, because of the Strait of Hormuz, like the
Yeah.
United Kingdom, which refused to get involved in the decapitation of Iran. I have a suggestion for you. Number one, buy from the US. We have plenty. Number two, build up some delayed courage, go to the Strait and just take it. You will have to start learning how to fight for yourself. The USA won't be there to help you anymore, just like you weren't there for us. Iran has been essentially decimated. The hard part is done. Go get your own oil. So, what's your take on
Well,
this?
it's nonsense again. I mean, here's Donald Trump saying, "Look, I've created this catastrophe. There's this massive shortage of aviation fuel. I've broken it, but it's for you to fix it.
Mhm.
I'm all right. I've got aviation fuel myself because we're self-sufficient." Not true, by the way. Absolutely, absolutely not true.
Mhm.
But don't look to me. I'm just the person who wrecked everything. Just go there and sort it all out by yourselves. I mean, it's Donald Trump to a piece. But of course, the way Donald Trump talks, and this is important to say, is
Mhm.
very like the way the Americans generally talk. They don't use this very crude
Mhm.
language, but the Americans always assume that they're there to do as much
Good.
damage as possible. And but if they themselves find themselves in trouble, then it's for the others to come and get them out of it. I mean, that's always a sort of assumption that all Americans always make.
I in my program, I told my Chinese audience, I said the best geopolitical book about United States is The Great Gatsby. Because
Yeah,
at the end of it, it's Tom and Daisy. They're very typical, right? They
yeah,
create this huge mess, and then they
yeah,
would say, "We are the good people."
yeah,
Other people clean the mess. That's their problem. We're the good people. We're trying to do good. If it
yes.
doesn't turn out the way, well, that's just the way it is, and let other clean
Yeah,
it, right?
exactly, exactly. That's brilliant. That's exactly. I remember that one. Yes.
Right? Tom and Daisy, The Great
Tom,
Gatsby.
and absolutely, of course I do. Yes, absolutely.
It's a very typical American author, wrote that book, right? So he knows Americans.
Yes, yes, it's brilliant, actually.
Yeah. Okay, so there's another thing going on that probably should get more attention, which is this seems to me like Europe is trying to decouple from the United States in the financial sector. So
Mm.
they have been launching different systems. One is called Vero, the other called Vera. I mean, it's a little bit confusing, but nonetheless, those system is designed very much to bypass Mastercard, Visa. So those are U.S. Financial companies. So Europe, these systems are basically to say we have our own system, financial payment system, and they already get their goal. I think Vera just launched the February.
Yeah,
Vero is for institutions, like transactions between them, but the Vera is make consumers. But nonetheless, they have this Vera. I think they combined several countries' system. They already
yeah,
have like 50 million
yeah,
users, and their goal is in the short term to get to 130. I think they're well on their way.
yeah.
That's very clear that Europe is trying to decouple from the United States in the financial sector. What do you take on
No,
that?
you're absolutely correct. I mean, it's the extraordinary thing, the incredible thing is that Europe, which was so loyal to the US, that
Hmm.
went through every conceivable, you
Yeah.
disaster as they followed US policy, is now finally coming to understand that this country, the US, is not its protector, it's a predator and disruptor, and that you cannot rely on American payment systems. You cannot rely on Visa, MasterCard. You cannot rely on the Americans for everything in the way that you could. That the whole concept of a collective West is a one-way street where the Americans get everything and the Europeans pay for everything.
Mhm.
And this, if this is now happening in a Europe whose political class has been incredibly resistant to this kind of thinking up to now. I mean, they've got out of their way to be as loyal to the Americans as possible. Then that does indeed tell you that we are on the brink of an enormous change.
This is something I think I mean, US dominance is in military first foremost, and then
Mm.
financial, right? And then
Yes,
tech. So
yes,
and then culture. But
yeah,
I would say culture goes with the rest. Or when you don't have the
absolutely,
rest dominance, your culture will gradually
exactly,
okay. But
exactly.
nonetheless, I think finance is a very important part of the US empire, right? And its
I
closest ally is undercutting it right now.
Yeah, finance is the most important part of the
Mhm.
US empire. I mean, manufacturing, China's far ahead.
Mhm.
Technology, the Americans pretend they're ahead of everybody, but they're not really.
Mhm.
China is at least as advanced.
Mhm.
Even other, I mean, Russia's not that far
Yeah.
behind.
Uh-huh.
In some sectors, it's at least equal. The Americans do not have a huge lead in technology.
Mhm.
Um, um, Military power, well, I think this war demonstrates that there are limits to that. And we've seen those limits in many other wars as well. So, military power, they don't have this enormous lead either. It's finite and culture, you're absolutely
Mhm.
correct. I mean, culture is a byproduct
Yeah.
of hard power. I
Mhm.
mean, and with the US, that will be especially transitory because they don't have the depth of culture that a society like China does. I mean,
Mhm.
thousands of years of it. So it ultimately does revolve around finance. We do not have, or we have not had, a
Mhm.
global financial system in the way that people think. What we have had is an American financial system, which the entire globe up to now has been using.
Mhm.
China has managed to carve out an exception successfully, but the rest of the world still functions inside the American financial system. That's why we use MasterCard. That's why we use Visa.
Mhm.
Swift ultimately is also part of this system because Swift is based on the dollar. The
Mhm.
banking systems are all based around the dollar. If we start moving away from that, if we no longer buy treasuries in the way that we did, then of course the whole system changes and America's power, I mean, its global power ultimately ends.
And the that's what Europe did, but also I
Yeah,
think right now Iran is before they become a law, but they are charging fees for
yeah,
many
absolutely.
countries as well, and they
Yes,
are using the
yes,
Chinese payment
yes.
system, the
Indeed.
SIPs, right? The,
Absolutely. So
the
all of this is a major crisis. And the wider that expands, the further it goes, the more Europeans start putting things together. The movements towards digital currencies that are
Mhm.
now being pushed in more and more countries, the more fragile the position of the United States um, in global terms becomes. Um, Military power, the United States still has an awful lot of, but it is not as big as great, it's not as dominant as it used to be. Um, if it loses control of global finance, then frankly, it's lost the game. Even information space, it doesn't control to anything like the degree that it once did.
yeah. And then culturally, we've already seen, like, for example, this year's Oscar, I don't think many people paid attention even to it.
Mm,
It used to
mm,
be Oscar is a big thing, right?
mm,
Everybody, oh, who won
mm.
this year? Go to the
Yeah,
movie theaters to watch those movies. And
yeah.
This year, I feel like nobody paid attention. Even I didn't pay attention to it, which is
No,
very
I
rare
mean, I
for
wasn't
me.
until you just mentioned it. I wasn't even aware that it had happened, actually. You're absolutely right. No, that's absolutely true.
Yeah. Okay. Britain. We talked about the British economy is bad. The latest one is OECD. They warned that Britain will be hit harder than the rest of the D7. Why is that? It says because the Middle East the sh oil shock, but I thought Britain itself has a lot of oil, isn't it?
Well, it does, but we don't have any. We don't keep reserves. I mean, that's the fundamental problem. Um, China has 6 months of reserves. We have 2 days. That's what we store. So that is the difference. Um, Understanding or explaining how that has come about really goes back to sets of economic policies that the British have been following since the 1980s. I mean, perhaps more than in any other country, we've had this idea that you follow the market, you you go to
Hmm.
the spot markets, you buy oil there. As you rightly say, we were a major producer of oil. I mean, that's well, we still produce some oil, but nowhere
Hmm.
near as much as we did. And we import oil now, which
Okay.
we're a net importer where we used to be a net exporter. So the fact that we produced our own oil meant that we had less reason to store oil. At least that's how we presented it to ourselves. It makes no logical sense anyway, or no real commercial sense. But the idea was, you export oil, you always have a certain amount of oil, and then if you need to buy oil, you buy it at low prices on the stock markets, and you pursue a very, very free trade, very free, not
Hmm.
free to free market
Hmm.
approach to it, laissez-faire approach to it.
Hmm.
And this has been the economic orthodoxy in Britain since the 1980s. And in fact, since Thatcher's time, because
Hmm.
Thatcher's often seen as the person who
Yeah.
led us to this,
Hmm.
which is true,
Hmm.
but it's become much more dogmatic. I mean, she was much more flexible. I mean, I remember her well. She was much more pragmatic and much more flexible. We have become more doctrinaire
Hmm.
about being, the people who go exclusively where the market is, and that trying to control prices or build up reserves or do that kind of thing is a mistake, and that it will only lead to bad outcomes. And of course, it's now left us disastrously exposed in the way that we now are.
Yeah, Thatcher and Reagan. For the US, it's Reagan, right, who changed a
Yes,
lot of things.
yes,
Yeah,
yes,
they were
yes,
at the time they were regarded as, the great leaders,
yes,
together
yes. Well,
changing. Yeah.
it was presented as being it was as being much more efficient
Hmm.
because it
Uh-huh.
meant that
Yeah.
you could take you could go out into the market, you could find where the oil was cheapest on the market because there's oil all over the place and things of
Hmm.
this kind. And of course, it did appeal to the trading instincts in Britain, which are very strong. I mean, the British people tend to think of British economic history as the country that pioneered the Industrial Revolution,
Hmm.
but the heart of Britain economically has always been deal making. We're more deal makers than actually producers. I
Hmm.
mean, there are the industrial cities, and there was the places where industry took place.
Hmm.
But the basic energy in Britain, the place where the big money always used to be made, was in finance and trade, and this very strongly appealed to that
Hmm.
kind of instinct in Britain.
And the France, Macron, they're going to host the D7 meeting in June this year. What's interesting with Macron is that he seems to understand that D7 by itself really is very insignificant now. So he tried to get some people to come. He first invited the South Africa, uh, Ramaphosa. But
yeah,
then, due to Trump's pressure or something, so they
yeah, yeah,
withdrew that invitation. And
yeah,
then the invitation to China, China basically said, we're not interested.
yeah.
What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, absolutely. I mean, this is an excellent example of Western leaders. And Macron, we've discussed him many times. Of all of the leaders of the West, he is perhaps the only one who has some intellectual grasp of the
Yeah.
changes that are taking place in the modern world.
Hmm.
But he is never able to follow through or take action based on that understanding. So you remember he goes to China, he meets Xi Jinping, he comes back, he's full of excitement about all the things China is doing. He says we should be part of that. The Americans phone him up, they bring him back to heel. He can starts
Hmm.
imposing more actions against the Chinese. So he now hosts the G7. He realizes intellectually that the G7 isn't the dominant thing that it used to be when it was basically set up back in the 1970s, in 1978, in Rambouillet in France
Hmm.
by President Giscard. So he understands you have to try and bring in other countries, but he's not asking himself, he's asking himself the right question,
Hmm.
but he comes up with the wrong answer because yes, tries to bring them the South Africans, and the Americans say no. He asks China to come. He doesn't ask himself the question, why would China want to come? Why? Why ultimately would China want to come? Just as like Trump says all the time, we should get the Russians back.
Hmm.
We should get the Russians to join. And again, Trump never asks himself the question, why would the Russians want
Yeah.
to come? The Russians always say no. The Chinese have now said no. I mean, what Macron ought to be asking himself is, what is the point of the G7 at all? What does it actually do, given that the countries that make it up are no longer the dominant economic powers in the
Hmm.
world today? And that is the question that no Western leader ever wants to face. Because if they did face it, they would understand that a completely different system
Hmm.
of running the global economy would make far more sense. And given the relative position of France, Britain, even Germany, there's a question about whether, in that case, those countries would even be part of it. I mean,
Hmm. Hmm.
I mean, I mean, you could argue that, if you had Russia, India, they might, Brazil even, might have some role to play. But the dominant powers now, economically, are the US and China, not the G7 at all. Certainly not France. What France decides is not going to make the weather economically in the way that what China and the US do make the weather. Of course, if the European Union were to organize itself properly, that would be different. But they're only now taking the first baby steps with this restructuring their financial markets. And we're very, very far from that yet.
What happened to France? France used to have a powerful leader, de Gaulle, right? And so, and now you have somebody who, I don't know. I mean, if you want to invite South Africa, just invite South Africa. Why,
Absolutely.
if the US saying no, you just,
Yeah. Well,
I don't get it. And it's not just him, but I remember that's something when the US kidnapped Meng Wanzhou, lots of people were talking similar things happened with France. And remember, this is a US ally.
yeah,
That was under Obama when GE was trying to take part of French company Alstom. I think the company is named Alstom. They're trying to take parts of that, and
yeah,
Alstom was resisting that. So they just arrested some high-level managers from Alstom. This was Obama did, and the French did
yeah.
nothing at the time. I think
Yes.
the president was Hollande or someone. They
Yes,
didn't
sir.
say anything. They just let it
No,
happen.
no, I know.
What happened to France?
Well, I know what did indeed happen to France. Many people in France ask this. I mean, if you're talking about General de Gaulle, whom I just remember, he is on the tip of my memory. I mean, he was a. I mean, if he'd taken the decision to invite Ramaphosa
Yeah.
to a meeting in Paris, in France,
Mhm.
and the Americans said, we don't want him there." De Gaulle would have just said, "Get stuffed. I am the president of France. This is my country. I invite to my country whomever I want." And well, but it's such a long time since we have seen a European leader of any kind respond in that way. So
Mhm.
I mean, I don't have a simple answer to this
Mhm.
question. The last French leader, in my opinion, who had independent agency, who had actual agency, was Jacques Chirac,
Yeah.
who said no at the time of the Iraq War in
Mhm.
2003.
Mhm.
Somehow, despite the fact that Chirac was absolutely right to say no about the Iraq War, the political class in Europe, ever since then, seems to have made the decision that that was a terrible mistake and that they need to, from now on, to agree with the Americans about everything, which amazes me. I mean, I really don't understand it, but that's where we are.
So according to this is JP Morgan,
Yeah,
according to their assessment, is that this oil shock effect will start in Asia, which probably is true because
yeah,
both
yeah,
the past week, both the Indian rupee and the Japanese yen has collapsed. Okay, so
yes,
and their stock market, South
yes,
Korean stock market, and all those things, it seems is affecting that. Now, that I do want to say, both in India and in Japan, they are American financial institutions, rush in and short on
yeah,
their currency. There is a lot of manipulations there too. But nonetheless, JP Morgan says Asian now, African will be early April, the real effect,
yeah,
and then mid-April will be hit Europe, and then late April will hit US. So that's the
yes,
order. It says that, it's going to hit like
yeah,
that.
yeah.
Do you think that's what's going to happen?
Yes, I
What's
think
with
that's exactly right. I think that's exactly what happened. We had a program about a week ago, 10 days ago, with a man called Ray Zucano, who
Mhm.
works in markets, and he made exactly the same point. He
Okay.
said that Asia will be hit first, and then gradually there'll be an echo effect, and eventually it will reach Europe in about a month's time,
Hmm.
which would bring us to mid to late April. And the point he made is a lot of it is based around cargoes. So an oil tanker takes about 2 months to reach Europe if it carries large amounts of oil from the Persian Gulf, unless it's traveling through the Red Sea. A lot of them go through around circumnavigate Africa. A lot of these cargoes, therefore, are still reaching Europe
Hmm.
from before their ships
Hmm.
that left the Persian Gulf before the conflict began on the 28th of February. So the Europeans still have that oil coming in.
Hmm.
But eventually, obviously, that
Hmm.
will dwindle and end. And at that point, that's when the real shortages will start.
And I think the other thing is we can never underestimate the financial institution from the US to take advantage of that, right? They're
Yeah,
going to exacerbate the situation, make it
yes,
worse, don't you
yes.
think?
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly what they're going to do because you're going to have all kinds of people in the markets who are going to be betting on higher prices,
Hmm.
depressions, that kind of thing. The way markets work nowadays is that they exacerbate, they make either depressions worse or booms um,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
go even higher. I mean, they're taking balance out of the system.
I still find it's in terms of the US. I mean one thing the US they just did is to allow E15. There's another oil that is gas that
Mm,
normally is banned during the summer because it's
yeah,
very it has higher ethanol content.
yeah,
So when it burns, it can be more smoke out of it.
yes,
So there it's more environmentally unfriendly. So in the
yes,
summer, it's banned. So now the EPA says, no, you can do that. You can continue to do it in the summer, which is a
yes,
sign of maybe they're expecting oil price will
yes,
spike. So they're giving you
yes,
some alternative and stuff like that. But U.S. has plenty of oil. I don't quite get that. This thing shouldn't affect the U.S. Domestic market, but it
You
does.
see, yes, you see, the oil with the US is very complex because the United States also imports a lot of oil. People don't quite understand this, but the
Mhm.
US imports produces rather heavy oil. It imports lighter oil to dilute the mix.
Okay.
So that there are imports of oil, and of course it also exports oil. Is that if we start to see worldwide oil shortages, the United States is going to ban exports of oil to make sure that there is enough oil on the market on the US domestic market so that oil doesn't leave the US chasing the higher prices. See, if in Europe
Uh-huh.
they're paying much more for oil
Uh-huh.
than in the US,
Hmm.
the oil producers in the US are going to be tempted to sell their oil in Europe
That's
rather
right.
than the US.
Uh-huh.
So this is going to uplift prices.
Uh-huh.
And of course,
Uh-huh.
the US has to at the same time import lighter strains
Uh-huh.
to they can get around the second problem through refining,
Hmm.
which is expensive. But I personally think, and Ray Zicano also thinks, that it is very likely if we start getting into the system of a global supply crisis, that you're going to see the US in the autumn stop oil exports. They've done that before, by the way. They
Hmm.
did that
Hmm.
in Jimmy Carter's day. And I have no doubt at all that Donald Trump will do that if he has to. By the way, there's a view out there which says that this is less likely to happen with LNG. Supposedly, the United States is self-sufficient, not only produces enough natural gas for itself, but has more than enough to export, so that they don't need to stop exports of natural gas, of LNG. I don't believe that. I'll
Hmm.
tell you that
Hmm.
straight away. I think that there's a lot of I suspect that when you go into the realities of the market, you will find otherwise. And I would not be surprised if in the autumn they ban exports of LNG as well. In which case, I mean, the crisis that Europe will face will be existential. I mean, without US LNG, uh, Germany now gets 90% of its gas, 90% of its LNG from the United States, is very heavily dependent on LNG now. I don't know what it does in that kind of situation.
Do you think they're going to Germany is going to start talking to Russia about the Nord Stream again?
Well, some people are talking about Germany doing that. The IFD are talking about that.
Hmm.
They're also saying, by the way, that Germany should now ask for all US troops in Germany to
Hmm.
leave.
Yeah. Hmm. Hmm.
But the point is that the current government are obviously not talking about doing either of those things.
Okay.
And again, this is where I think there needs to be some explanation because let's say
Hmm.
that there is a massive oil crisis in Europe and we are in February and there's no oil and prices are shooting up and
Hmm.
there's rationing. And they decide at that point that they're going to go to the Russians and say, can we please reopen Nord Stream and Yamal and all of that? It will take months to get that
Yeah.
up and running
Hmm.
again. I mean, it's not that simple. I mean,
Hmm.
you need to find out what state these pipes are in, first of all. I mean, pipes deteriorate. There needs to
Hmm.
be all kinds of things done. And then, of course, there's the further issue of, I mean, Russia does an infinite production of natural
Hmm.
gas. I mean, they've now recommitted a lot of that gas to other things, to China, but also a lot of it for their own domestic use.
Hmm.
So it would take, if you started talking with the Russians about this now, yes, you might
Hmm.
be able to do something. But leaving it to the last moment, which is what we're likely to do,
Hmm.
isn't the way these things are done. In China, they understand that, by the way.
Hmm. Hmm.
In Europe, we don't.
Yeah, China is very good at planning ahead. From this time, in every, I mean, look at the EVs. The Chinese EV are now
Yeah.
sold everywhere. They breaking record after record. But the EV
20,
thing
20,
also has,
20 plus year program.
yes,
I
yeah,
learned that from you, by the way. I then
yeah,
followed it up and researched it.
yeah,
And you're absolutely right. And that's exactly right. No,
yeah.
we don't plan ahead. We don't have a clue how to plan ahead. But we don't. We just don't do that. And then what's going to happen is in February, let's say it's in February, we are out of oil, out of gas. And the Russians say, well, the hell, sorry. I mean, uh, we can't just turn the tap on again. And then there'll be all sorts of people writing in the newspaper. So you see, the Russians you can't trust. They're not prepared to supply us with the gas after all. And this proves that they hate us and want to destroy us. So we just don't govern ourselves intelligently anymore in
Mhm.
the way that we used to do. And in China, of course, they absolutely do.
Yeah, in terms of EVs and this whole alternative energy thing, China is not the one who started that. It is the West talking about
Mhm.
environment, right? That it has to be
Yeah.
sustainable, all that sort of thing. And
Mhm.
China listened to it and thinking, well, actually that makes sense because
Mhm.
China also needs a sustainable energy. Okay, so let's see what we can do. So China take it seriously, whereas the
Yeah.
West seems to me, when you're talking about environment and sustainability, all those sort of things. I don't think they were very serious about that. They were
No, they weren't
talking
very
about
serious
it,
about it. They
right?
weren't very serious. There's something else here. It's a very important thing to understand, which is that when the Chinese saw that all of this was going on and people were going for electrification and all of that, the Chinese looked at that and they said, right, well, firstly, we can do this.
Hmm.
Secondly, we should do this. We
Yeah.
should do
Hmm.
this for environmental reasons. But we should do this also because this is a technological breakthrough.
Hmm.
This is going to shift technology onto a completely different level.
Hmm.
And we didn't do that. We didn't think about it in that way in the West. We did this for environmental reasons in some cases, for commercial reasons in others,
Yeah. Yeah.
because affluent people who like to vote green in suburbs wanted to have electric cars because they were a virtue signaling statement. There's an awful lot of that, an awful lot of that in Britain, by the way.
Hmm.
Um, uh, um, so there was never a serious look at saying to yourself, how is future energy going to be produced?
Hmm.
What is the future economy going to look like? We just don't do that in the West at all. And in China, they did.
Hmm.
And that's why they are where they are. And
Hmm.
everything else dovetails. China works on EVs, it works on metals, it works on rare earths, it looks at nuclear power plants, it discusses dams, it does this whole integrated approach to economic development, which of course we're not capable of, or even capable of thinking about in the West anymore. And that's the fundamental problem.
In China, there's still a lot of people, and me included, believe that the whole thing about green energy was at least partially the purpose was to curb developing countries from developing. I actually
It
think
was.
there's some truth to it.
Oh, there's no question about it. I remember it very well. I mean, there was, I mean, it was openly talked about in connection with China.
Hmm.
China, you see, are these smokestack industries producing coal and all of that, based on coal. So we force them to buy all this very expensive tech that we are the only people who are going to be able to produce. We're going to stop their development entirely.
Hmm.
And that was another reason. I mean, so as well as virtue signaling and ecological, it was. There's no doubt at all because I remember. I remember reading articles about this, all sorts of people. You could see them, the sort of orchestrated articles about the terrible Chinese who are filthy and
Mhm.
destroying the ecology, and we
Uh-huh.
can't think we mustn't buy their goods because of the terrible economic costs
Yeah.
associated with them. I remember all of that.
Mhm.
But as I said, the Chinese, as I said, they didn't, they looked at these technologies and they said, look, we've got to do this because for all of these reasons.
Mhm.
But if we do it, it will bring our economies
Mhm.
to an entirely different level. By the way, it's not just the Europeans. I mean, I want to talk about a rather sad subject, which is Cuba. Because one of
Uh-huh.
the things I learned very recently about Cuba is that a couple of years ago, China came along to Cuba and said, look, you are over dependent on oil. You've
Mhm.
been obsessed about producing oil on your own country, and it's impossible because the geology isn't good.
Mhm.
You're getting oil from Venezuela. Let us work with you.
Mhm.
You're a tropical country. You have sunlight all the year round. We can provide you with solar panels. We can provide you with batteries. We can work with you on a sustained program for the electrification of your country.
Mhm.
And the Cubans said no, which I
Mhm.
find unbelievable. And what they said instead is what we're going to focus on is developing our tourist industry because that's where the money
Mhm.
is going to come in. And well, China said all of this. Tourism, of course, makes you, in the end, more dependent on the West. That was the choice they made. And now we see the result.
Yeah. And now everybody's rushing to buy the solar panels now. So the
Yeah,
solar panel
absolutely.
is another big selling point now. Yeah.
China actually has airlifted solar panels to Cuba over the
Hmm.
last couple of weeks, but
Yeah.
this has been done in a way that well, it make a difference,
Yeah.
but it could have been approached and done in a completely different way.
Different.
I know
Yeah.
all about this. I've had
Mhm.
discussions with people who know. Um, I know how concerned the US was about these discussions, which took place between the Cubans and the Chinese.
Mhm.
It's unbelievable that people didn't see the opportunities there.
Well, that's why China is so unique in so many ways
Yeah,
because
yeah.
lots of times it's hard to convince somebody something might happen, down the
Yes,
street. It could
yes.
happen,
Well,
but lots of people don't see it
yes,
that far.
I
Yeah. Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, it's absolutely correct. I mean, so, Cuba very happy with its
Hmm.
relationship with Venezuela,
Hmm.
not
Yeah.
considering what might happen
Yeah.
if that were ever to end.
Yeah. The Japanese, this is, I don't see anywhere reported, but the Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi apparently tried to call Putin, and Putin even didn't pick up the phone. She she
I
wanted to
didn't
buy
know that.
oil. She wanted to buy oil from Russia, but guess what? She insisted on this price cap. Which world she's living in?
Oh, I've heard about that. Yes. That now this explains because I've suddenly seen a whole flurry of articles in the Russian media saying that
Okay.
the Russians will not sell oil to any country that applies the price cap.
Uh-huh.
And
Yeah.
I've been wondering, well, what's all this
Hmm.
all about? Because I mean, it
Yeah.
doesn't make any kind of sense. They didn't mention Japan,
Hmm.
but that's clearly what this is all about.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, all I can say is these people are not living in the real world.
I mean, originally, I think Takaichi is very aggressive, far right
Mm.
kind of a representative.
Yeah.
But now I just think she's downright stupid. I mean, don't you agree?
Yeah, well, well, I mean, to be honest, I mean, I'm going to say straight away, being far right and aggressive doesn't mean you're clever. I would argue that in terms of Japan's interests, being aggressive is actually frankly stupid.
Hmm.
I mean, the intelligent policy for Japan to follow would be to improve relations with China,
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
which, by the way, I can remember, one time weren't that bad actually. I mean,
Hmm.
my rice cooker, uh, uh, I bought it from a Japanese company. It's very good, by the way. It's
Hmm.
made in China. So
Hmm.
there you go.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, when I see the number, it was, the
Mm.
when she called, supposedly tried to call Putin, the oil price at that time was $102 per barrel. I mean, the price cap last year was $60. And recently, before this whole thing started, at the beginning of this year, Japan even lowered it to 47.60. If
Yeah,
that's the price she's asking, does she even think when she asks? I mean,
I know.
if this were me, I would be too embarrassed even to
Well,
ask.
absolutely. Yes.
Yeah,
What you say astonishes me, but it shouldn't really. I mean, because we see so much absurdity in the world today that,
yeah. Speaking of stupidity, there's recently another event that got lots of attention in China. So there's a conference called the NeurIPS, Conference on Neural Information Processing Systems. It's an pretty
Mm.
renowned, prestigious AI conference that happens every year. So, for whatever reason, they all of a sudden decided on their website said they are going to comply with the US sanctions list. So, whoever is sanctioned, they're not going to take their paper and whatever. Well, that's including a lot of the AI companies in China, a
Oh,
lot of
right.
tech companies like Huawei. And the thing is, Huawei and then a whole bunch of other Chinese tech companies actually has been sponsored this AI conference.
Oh,
So, of
right.
course, China saw it, and then immediately the Chinese government just put out an announcement that from now on, we're not going to sponsor these kind of conference, meaning you
Well,
can still go there yourself, but the Chinese government is going to pay for your trip. Not only that, for any promotion, stuff like
yeah.
that, your paper presented on this conference is not going to be counted as, prestigious papers. I mean, how stupid is that, right? So they
Well, it is.
quickly realized this is so stupid. So they put out not really much of an apology on their X account. It's kind of like, let's explain, there's a misunderstanding, blah, blah. But it's too late. But
No.
again, how stupid can they be? This is an AI conference. They could just basically exclude China. What were they
Unreal.
thinking?
What are they thinking? No, I know. Um, this deference to US sanctions is completely stupid. I mean, you
Mhm.
can see this with India and the mess that India made. Now, I mean, with Russian oil, I mean,
Yeah.
they did, as a matter of fact, they continued to import Russian oil, even when they said they weren't.
Hmm.
But what they needed to do, what they should have done, is said, look, we are not going to comply with US sanctions,
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
US tariffs. If the US wants to impose tariffs like that on us, that's their decision. But
Hmm.
under no circumstances are we going to let ourselves
Yeah.
have our economic policy dictated by
Mhm.
the United States. And that's what they should have done. They didn't. They didn't. And now they are in a very bad way, by the way, because the Russians are supplying oil to India, but there's issues.
Mhm.
Some of the Russian shippers are uncertain, and oil supplies from Russia were reduced during the winter. And now, they have to try and make up the shortfall. And the trust is eroded. And the organizers of this conference were even more stupid, even more stupid. Um, an AI conference without China, which is leading the world in AI.
Trying to do everything possible to make themselves irrelevant, in my view.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, I know, I know.
no, it's interesting you're talking about India. So recently there is an event that happened was that there were
Yeah,
7 oil tanks was heading to China, but then India offered a higher price. Not only that, but also the penalties. So those seven
yeah,
oil tanks did went to India, which means they did pay a lot more than they could have if they didn't really go
yeah.
along with the sanctions. But again, like what we talked about previously, lots of countries don't see that far ahead, right? They
No, no, of course
always
not.
look at right now, and I guess for Modi, U.S. is still a very important market, I guess. So he caved somewhat, I think.
Oh, he did cave. I mean,
Yeah.
he behaved with complete lack of self-respect.
Hmm.
I think that India damaged its reputation very badly.
Hmm.
Um, he's a strange man. I mean, he went to China.
Hmm.
He went to all the celebrations. You remember in the summer, there's that
Yeah.
famous picture of him with Xi Jinping
Hmm.
and Putin. But then it's as if he got cold feet and said to
Hmm.
himself, "What have I done?" And he sort of tilted in the other direction. Um, Ultimately, this explains for me why India, despite all the impressive growth figures that it
Hmm.
churns out, isn't really developing. I
No.
mean, the gap between India and China actually is growing.
Hmm.
It's not reducing, it's growing.
Hmm.
And um, India needs to be much more tough-minded about
Hmm.
the way it goes about its business. I mean, I remember when China opened up in the 70s and opened and developed in the 80s, and it was the period when China had its people talk about the quiet rise and all of that.
Hmm.
But China was never really quiet. They were always there. I mean, they
Hmm.
were always there to fight for their own interests and to make absolute. I mean, they would never have let the Americans dictate to them in that kind of way.
Hmm. Yeah, but it's not, I guess it's not very easy to stand up to the United States. It's still, I guess, even though China put, set an example, but lots of people
Mm.
thinking, well, you have the rare earth, other countries don't have that power. But I do think, I mean, I think Brazil have stand up to the United States too, right? So Brazil
Yes.
doesn't have the card, the rare earth, but Brazil just like a whatever. We do whatever we think is
Well,
best for our
exactly.
country, right?
Yes.
So,
The China has provided not just the example,
mhm,
but the precedent.
mhm,
If China is where it is because it made certain decisions.
mhm,
One of those decisions was that it said to itself, if we are having dealings with the United States, we have to be ready sometimes to say no.
mhm. And you look at the Iran, right? Iran has been
Mm,
trying to compromise and
mm,
negotiations and get
mm.
them nowhere. But look
The,
at them
the
now.
Rush the Russians say the same about themselves.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
it's interesting. It's the last 10 years that you start to see a sort of change in Russia and
Hmm.
an
Hmm.
upgrade in Russia.
Hmm.
But, they were forced to this because constantly one concession after another, one
Hmm.
negotiation after another. My friend Glenn Deason says the
Hmm.
salami tactic. The Americans come along and they take
Hmm.
one slice and then they come back and they want another and another and another, and you give
Yeah.
it to them all the time. The Russians finally,
Hmm.
when the crisis in Ukraine took off. They finally said, enough,
Hmm.
this has to stop. But before then,
Hmm.
I mean, it sounds incredible today. They were even thinking of buying their weapons from France and the United States. I mean, shutting down their own military industries. I mean, it's at least they've got there, and at least there was always
Hmm.
opposition.
Hmm.
But far too many countries are still in awe of
Hmm.
the US. China never was, never at any point since liberation has
Yeah.
been.
And that's I think that's part of the reason in the West that
Yeah,
they want to dismiss Mao, because Mao
yeah,
did bring the
yeah.
pride back to country. I do think that if nothing
Exactly.
else, he made all kinds of mistakes, but he did one thing very, very important, which is bring the pride back to the country.
Pride and
Yeah,
confidence. I mean, what was it he
confidence.
said?
Hmm.
Chinese people have now stood up, and he's
Hmm.
absolutely. That was the key. That was his greatest. That was his greatest contribution to China.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Yeah. And it seems very, very hard. I mean, even China was trying to be accommodating, but China has its limit. I do think like when the US kidnapped no, Mo Wanzhou, that was a waking up moment. Like you do this,
Yes,
you
it is.
kidnap
Yeah,
somebody's daughter,
yes,
so
yes.
because this somebody is the head of the tech company. It's just like when you do something like a beyond recognizable boundary, right? Moral boundary. I think the damage is very way deeper than people realize, I think.
Well,
So,
quite. I mean, there's the fundamental difference between negotiation and being reasonable and engaging in appeasement.
yeah, yeah.
China has never engaged in appeasement.
let's see what's happened next. There's
Indeed.
so many things in the air going now.
Yes.
Let's see. Let's talk
Yeah.
next week.
We'll stay in touch. Have a great week.
See you
See you.
next week. Bye.
Bye.